Daniel was already standing up, gripping his coat tight to hide his shaking hands. The woman across from him didn't scream, but her words cut deeper than any insult.
You and your daughter are just too much baggage for me.
He accepted the rejection in silence, like he always did. But just as he turned to walk away humiliated, a heavy hand grabbed his shoulder. It was the restaurant owner. The entire room went quiet. What this owner did next turned the worst night of Daniel's life into something.
Your dignity isn't for sale, and tonight, you are my guest of honor.
He didn't even think he deserved anymore. If you are a father, or if you've ever been judged for putting your child first, this story isn't about a date gone wrong. It's about dignity, second chances, and the quiet strength it takes to keep showing up as a parent. Subscribe to The Father's Journey and follow stories where fatherhood changes everything. The fluorescent lights of the supermarket flickered, casting a pale, sickly glow over the discounted cereal aisle. Daniel checked the price of the generic oats twice, his thumb tracing the worn edge of a $5 bill in his pocket. Beside him, Lily tugged at his sleeve, her eyes fixed on a colorful box of sugary rings she knew better than to ask for. He ruffled her hair, a gesture meant to soothe them both, sensing the weight of the grocery list that never seemed to get shorter. Being a parent meant mastering the art of the silent calculation, weighing the necessity of milk against the luxury of a single red apple for her lunchbox. He felt the eyes of the cashier on his faded jacket, a gaze that didn't see a man or a provider, but a statistic of the neighborhood. The apartment stayed quiet after Lily fell asleep, the hum of the refrigerator filling the gaps in his thoughts. Daniel sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the invitation on his phone screen. Emma was someone from a different version of his life, a time before diapers and sleepless nights and the constant, dull ache of being overlooked by a world that valued speed over stability. He hesitated before typing a reply, wondering if he still remembered how to speak to someone who didn't require him to cut their food into tiny pieces. He agreed to the date, feeling a sudden, sharp pang of guilt as if seeking his own happiness was a theft from his daughter's future. Work at the warehouse was a blur of heavy crates and impersonal checklists, overseen by a supervisor who only spoke to point out delays. Daniel moved with a practiced efficiency, his body aching in places he no longer bothered to name. He handled the fragile cargo with a tenderness that went unnoticed by his peers, aware that his employment rested on the whim of a man who didn't know his last name. The pressure to remain invisible while being perfectly productive was a tightrope. He walked for 10 hours a shift. As he washed the grease from under his fingernails that evening, he looked at his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror, trying to find the person Emma had once known. He straightened his only button-down shirt, realizing he was terrified of being found lacking by someone who lived without the anchors that held him in place. The restaurant smelled of expensive cedar and roasted garlic, a sensory world away from the steam of Daniel's cramped kitchen. He sat across from Emma, feeling the stiffness of his collar against a neck used to cotton t-shirts. Emma looked radiant, her presence polished in a way that made Daniel feel like a rough sketch in a room full of finished paintings. They talked of travel and career trajectories, but Daniel found himself checking his watch, calculating the minutes until the babysitter needed to leave. He tried to focus on Emma's story about a weekend in the mountains, but his mind kept drifting to the loose floorboard in his hallway that he still needed to fix. The shift in the evening happened when Daniel mentioned the upcoming school play, his voice softening with a pride he couldn't suppress. Emma's smile didn't vanish, but it tightened, becoming a polite mask. She leaned back, putting a deliberate inch of space between her elbows and the table. She spoke of her life as a series of open doors and spontaneous departures, a narrative that had no room for a man whose schedule was dictated by school bells and fever dreams. The realization hit Daniel not as a shock, but as a cold, familiar rain. He watched her realize that he wasn't a partner she could mold, but a package deal with commitments she viewed as burdens. Her rejection was delivered with a surgical kindness that felt worse than an insult. She suggested that perhaps the timing was a mistake, her eyes darting toward the exit as if she were already halfway there. Daniel felt the weight of the surrounding tables, the soft clink of silverware, sounding like judgment in the sudden silence. He began to gather his coat, his movements heavy and deliberate, preparing for the walk of shame past the diners, who had witnessed his quiet dismissal. He felt smaller than he had at the warehouse, reduced to a man who had reached for something beyond his station only to have his fingers swiped away. As he stood to leave, a hand landed firmly but gently on his shoulder. Miguel, the owner of the establishment, had been observing from the shadows of the bar. He didn't look at Emma. His focus remained entirely on Daniel. Miguel signaled to a waiter, his voice calm and resonant enough to command the attention of the nearby tables. He told Daniel that the kitchen had just prepared a specialty that required a discerning palate to appreciate. He gestured for Daniel to sit back down, treating him with a level of deference usually reserved for critics or old friends. The social hierarchy of the room shifted in a single heartbeat, leaving Emma standing alone in the wake of a dignity she hadn't expected Daniel to possess. The meal that followed was an exercise in quiet restoration. Daniel ate slowly, the flavors of the unexpected dish grounding him in a way Emma's conversation never could. Miguel didn't linger to hover, but his presence remained a protective layer over the table, a silent buffer against the residual sting of the encounter. Across the room, near the brass-railed service station, Clara stood with a clipboard pressed against her chest. She had watched the entire exchange, her gaze lingering on the way Daniel's shoulders finally dropped from their defensive hunch. She saw the rough texture of his hands against the white linen, recognizing the marks of a person who built things while others merely bought them. Clara moved through the dining room with a grace that masked a deep, internal exhaustion. Her role was to ensure the comfort of others, a task that often left her own needs fading into the background of the restaurant's nightly theater. When she walked past Daniel's table to adjust a floral arrangement, she caught his eye for a fraction of a second. There was no pity in her look, only a steady, shared understanding of what it meant to hold a position of service in a world that rarely looked at the server. She noticed the way he folded his napkin with meticulous care, a small habit that spoke of a man who didn't take space or resources for granted. As the restaurant began to thin out, the atmosphere grew heavy with the scent of extinguished candles and expensive wine. Daniel prepared to leave, reaching for his wallet, but Miguel shook his head from behind the bar with a definitive, warm smile. The gesture was a gift of visibility, a recognition that Daniel's worth wasn't tied to the bill he couldn't easily afford. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat, a physical manifestation of a pride that had been bruised and then suddenly, unexpectedly mended. He realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't just a father or a worker. He was a guest invited to the table of common humanity. He stepped out into the cool night air, the streetlights reflecting off the damp pavement in long, golden streaks. The rejection that had felt like an ending an hour ago now felt like a shedding of skin. He walked toward the bus stop, his pace steadier than it had been on the way in, knowing that Lily would be waiting for him with a sleepy smile and a story about her dreams. He looked back at the glowing windows of the restaurant, seeing Clara's silhouette as she began the closing procedures. He didn't know her name yet, but he felt the strange, lingering warmth of having been seen by a stranger who understood the value of a quiet heart. The following Tuesday, Daniel returned to the restaurant, though this time he didn't enter through the front door. He arrived early, before the dinner rush, carrying a heavy toolbox and holding Lily's hand. Miguel had mentioned a broken refrigeration latch during their brief talk, and Daniel, sensing a way to repay a debt of dignity, had offered his skills. He sat Lily at a small corner table with her coloring books, the vibrant crayons contrasting with the muted elegance of the dining room. He worked on the kitchen floor, his movements rhythmic and precise, finding a strange peace in the mechanical logic of screws and hinges. Clara emerged from the back office, pausing when she saw the small girl focused on a drawing of a lopsided sun. She didn't approach immediately, instead observing the way Daniel paused every few minutes to check on his daughter. He didn't use words. He simply looked up, met Lily's eyes, and nodded, a silent tether that kept the child anchored and safe. Clara felt a sharp, familiar tug in her chest, a reminder of the quiet spaces in her own life that she usually filled with work. She walked over to the table and knelt, bringing herself down to Lily's level without a hint of condescension. She asked Lily about the color she had chosen, her voice low and genuine. Daniel watched from the floor, his wrench stilled for a moment, He saw the way Clara didn't tower over the child, but instead invited herself into Lily's world. The impersonal rules of the restaurant, no children in the service area, no personal business during prep, seemed to soften in the heat of that small interaction. Clara looked up and caught Daniel watching. For a moment, the roles of manager and handyman dissolved, leaving only two people recognizing a shared language of care. The shift in status was subtle but absolute. Daniel wasn't a charity case or a customer. He was a fixer, someone whose presence improved the environment. When the latch finally clicked into place, Miguel appeared, testing the door with a satisfied grunt. He handed Daniel a cold glass of water, treating him with the easy respect of a peer. However, the moment was interrupted by the arrival of the evening staff, some of whom looked at Daniel's work clothes and Lily's scattered crayons with visible disdain. They moved with a hurried, cold efficiency that made the room feel smaller, their looks suggesting that the father and daughter were a clutter that needed to be cleared before the real guests arrived. Recognition often surfaces from the most unexpected places. If you believe a man's worth is found in his integrity and the care he provides for those he loves, leave your mark on this video. Subscribe to follow how this small seed of respect begins to change the path for Daniel and Lily. The staff began their nightly ritual of polishing silver, their movements sharp and mechanical. One waiter, a man with a perfectly straight tie and a gaze that didn't drop below eye level, moved Lily's coloring books a few inches to the side to set a salt shaker. The gesture was small, but the dismissal behind it was vast. He didn't look at the child, treating her presence like a smudge on a window pane. Daniel felt the familiar heat of protective instinct rise in his chest, but he remained still. He had learned that for people like him, an outburst was merely proof of a lack of belonging. He began to pack his tools, the metallic clatter of the wrenches sounding like a countdown to his departure. Clara noticed the waiter's coldness and stepped forward, her authority shifting from a quiet hum to a focused beam. She didn't raise her voice, but she placed her hand firmly on the table, preventing the waiter from moving the books any further. She told him that the table was occupied by guests of the house, and that his attention would be better spent in the wine cellar. The waiter blinked, the hierarchy of the restaurant exposing a moral fracture. He followed the rules of aesthetics, but Clara followed the rules of character. The staff watched in silence as the power shifted, the manager choosing the man in the work boots over the polished veneer of her own team. Daniel stood up, his hand resting on the back of Lily's chair. He saw the vulnerability in Clara's eyes, a fleeting shadow that suggested she knew the cost of taking a side. She wasn't just defending a table. She was defending a shared sense of worth that they both struggled to maintain. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with the things they couldn't say in a room built for performance. Daniel realized that her strength wasn't in her title, but in her refusal to become as cold as the marble counters she managed. He felt a sudden, terrifying urge to reach out, to acknowledge the weight she was carrying, but the distance of their roles remained a physical barrier. The judgment of the room lingered as the first patrons began to arrive, their voices creating a cacophony that pushed Daniel and Lily toward the exit. He felt the contrast between the warmth of the kitchen and the clinical perfection of the foyer. As he pushed open the heavy glass door, he looked back and saw Clara standing alone in the center of the room, her silhouette framed by the amber glow of the chandeliers. She looked like a woman who had won a battle but was still waiting for the war to end. Daniel realized then that they were both navigating a system that valued the shine of the surface over the strength of the foundation, and the realization felt like a bruise that wouldn't stop pulsing. The following week, Daniel found himself returning to the restaurant under the guise of checking the refrigeration seal, though his heart knew the lie. He arrived as the sun dipped below the city skyline, painting the brickwork in shades of bruised purple. Clara was there, standing by the bar with a glass of water, her usual composure replaced by a stillness that bordered on sadness. When she saw him, her expression didn't change, but her hand tightened around the glass. They were alone in the lull before the rush, the air thick with the scent of floor wax and the ghosts of 1,000 previous dinners. She spoke first, her voice a low murmur that barely carried across the polished wood. She confessed that the waiter from the previous night had filed a complaint with Miguel, citing a breach of professional standards. Daniel felt a cold, knot of guilt tighten in his stomach. Realizing his presence had brought a storm to her doorstep, he offered to leave, to stay away, his voice thick with the habit of retreating to protect others. But Clara shook her head, a single, sharp movement. She told him that for the first time in years, she felt like she was actually seeing the room she spent 12 hours a day inhabiting. The system was showing its cracks, and she was no longer interested in filling them with silence. The distance between them felt like a physical weight, a chasm built of shared fears and the responsibilities that dictated their lives. Daniel wanted to step forward, to bridge the gap with a gesture that wasn't a repair or a service, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. He saw the fatigue in the corners of her eyes and the way she held herself as if bracing for a blow. She was a woman who had spent a lifetime being the anchor for an entire establishment, yet she looked as though she were drifting. The emotional vulnerability of the moment was so raw that it felt like an intrusion on the polished perfection of the dining room. When the first customer walked in, a man in an expensive suit who didn't bother to look at either of them, the spell was broken. Clara immediately straightened her spine, the mask of the professional manager sliding back into place with a practiced ease. Daniel picked up his toolbox, the weight of the metal familiar and grounding. He walked toward the back exit, feeling the sudden, sharp sting of emotional distancing. He had reached out in the dark and found a hand, only to have the lights flicker on and force them both to pull away. As the door closed behind him, he felt the cold night air rush into his lungs, a reminder that some gaps were meant to stay wide. The tension reached its peak on a Friday night, when the restaurant was a sea of moving bodies and demanding voices. Emma had returned, seated at a prominent table with a companion, her presence a sharp reminder of the night Daniel had been cast aside. She watched the room with a practiced air of belonging, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the kitchen, where Daniel was helping Miguel move a heavy delivery of crates. When Daniel emerged, wiping sweat from his forehead, their eyes met. Emma offered a shallow, curious smile, as if considering whether a second chance at her attention was a prize he might still want to win. Clara stood at the podium, her knuckles white as she gripped the leather-bound guest book. She saw the way Emma looked at Daniel, not as a man, but as a curiosity to be entertained. For the first time, the professional wall Clara had built around her heart began to crumble. The jealousy was not a roar, but a quiet, steady burn, a realization that she had allowed her fear of the past to keep her in the shadows. She watched Daniel turn away from Emma, his movements lacking any hesitation. He didn't seek the approval of the woman who had rejected him. Instead, his gaze found Clara across the crowded room, a silent affirmation of where his loyalty remained. The evening took a turn when a high-profile guest complained about the noise, pointing a finger at the kitchen staff. The customer demanded that the laborers be kept out of sight of the paying clientele. The air in the room seemed to thin as the staff looked to Clara to settle the matter. The pressure to maintain the illusion of a seamless, frictionless world was immense. For a moment, it seemed she might follow the script, apologizing for the intrusion of the real world into the bubble of the elite. She looked at Daniel, who stood by the service door, his presence a reminder of everything that was honest and enduring. Clara did not apologize. She spoke with a clarity that cut through the ambient chatter, stating that the people who maintained the heart of the building were never an intrusion. The silence that followed was heavy, a collective holding of breath as the hierarchy was challenged. Daniel saw the risk she was taking, the potential end of her career in a place she had helped build. He stepped forward, not to fight her battle, but to stand as a testament to her words. The emotional distancing that had defined their last encounter vanished, replaced by a bridge of mutual respect that no rule could dismantle. He stood his ground, maintaining his integrity even as the room judged him, knowing that being seen by her was the only recognition that mattered. The aftermath of the confrontation didn't result in an explosion, but in a quiet, tectonic shift. Miguel, having witnessed the stand Clara took, didn't reprimand her. Instead, he approached Daniel the following evening, not with a task, but with a small wooden box. Inside was a set of keys to the side entrance, a symbolic gesture that Daniel was no longer just a fixer or a temporary ghost in the hallway. He was part of the foundation. Miguel spoke of a permanent position, one that would offer the stability Daniel had only dared to imagine while counting pennies in the supermarket aisle. The recognition wasn't based on a title, but on the undeniable quality of his presence. The impact radiated outward, most notably toward Lily. Daniel brought her to the restaurant on a quiet Sunday afternoon, and this time, there were no cold glares from the staff. He watched from the bar as Clara walked Lily through the small herb garden Miguel kept on the back patio. Clara took a sprig of rosemary and crushed it between her fingers, showing the girl how to find the scent hidden beneath the surface. Daniel saw his daughter's face light up, a look of pure, unburdened belonging that she had rarely experienced outside their small apartment. The world was finally opening up for her, not because of a sudden windfall, but because her father had stood his ground until the world adjusted its focus. Clara approached Daniel as the sun began to set, the light catching the silver locket she always wore. She didn't talk about the restaurant or the rules. She spoke about the fear of being needed and the greater fear of being alone. She reached out, her hand hovering over his for a moment before he closed the distance. The touch was simple, a grounding of two people who had spent too long navigating the world in isolation. He realized that her strength had always been a mirror to his own, a quiet resilience that didn't need to shout to be heard. The symbolic gestures of the restaurant, the way the tables were set, the way the light fell across the floor, took on a new meaning. It was no longer a stage for others to perform their lives. It was a space where he and Clara were building something authentic. Daniel looked at the keys in his hand and then at the woman standing beside him. He saw a future where he didn't have to apologize for his life or hide the parts of himself that were tired. The recognition he felt wasn't just professional. It was the transformative power of being understood by someone who saw the value in the struggle. The final hour of the evening arrived, but the air felt lighter than it ever had during the years of Daniel's solitude. The restaurant was nearly empty, the chairs upturned on the tables like sleeping birds. Daniel helped Clara with the final locking of the cabinets, their movements synchronized in a quiet dance of shared responsibility. He no longer felt like a trespasser in this world of polished wood and soft lighting. He had become part of its heartbeat. He checked his phone, seeing a photo the babysitter had sent of Lily sleeping soundly, a crayon still clutched in her small hand. The constant, gnawing anxiety that had defined his fatherhood was replaced by a steady, quiet warmth. Clara paused by the front window, looking out at the street where the city was beginning to settle into a hushed rhythm. She turned to Daniel, her expression open and stripped of the professional armor she had worn for a decade. She spoke of the upcoming weekend, suggesting a trip to the park with Lily, a proposal that carried the weight of a long-term promise. Daniel didn't offer a grand speech or a declaration of undying devotion. He simply nodded, his hand finding hers in the dim light. He offered her a life that was honest, a path marked by the consistency of a man who knew how to stay when things became difficult. The romance didn't ignite with a flash, but settled into place like a well-fitted stone. They walked toward the exit together, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. Daniel realized that the disastrous date with Emma hadn't been a failure, but a necessary shedding of an old, ill-fitting skin. It had led him to a place where he didn't have to choose between being a father and being a man. He saw that the respect Miguel had shown him and the courage Clara had found were the real currencies of a life well lived. Wealth was a fleeting shadow, but the dignity of being seen was a foundation that could weather any storm. As he pulled the heavy glass door shut, Daniel felt the weight of the keys in his pocket, a solid reminder of the stability they had built together. The restaurant stood behind them, a symbol of a place where strangers had become family through small, persistent acts of humanity. He walked Clara to her car, the silence between them comfortable and full of unspoken plans. The future didn't look perfect, and the work would still be hard, but he was no longer walking toward it alone. He looked up at the stars, feeling the immense, quiet power of a life that had finally found its true north. Real love doesn't require a grand stage, only presence and courage. If this narrative moved you, share it with someone else who understands the nobility found in silence and daily care. Thank you for spending your time with us here on the channel. We will see you at our next meeting.